Over the weekend, I went, right after class last week, we flew up to Utah to do a couple of things, and one of them was I went to attend what's called a branding seminar. It doesn't mean that they hogtied me and laid me down and branded me, although that would probably be interesting as well. Branding is a new term. I mean, it's an old term, but it's very in vogue right now, which is to say that it is to think about how you present your little business or your message. We've come full circle back to a little world of cottage industries, rather like our agrarian society used to be, where people would sell eggs or they'd sell butter. Now they have Instagram followers and they model clothes and Nordstrom pays them some money. And these little cottage industries, I think, are so marvelous especially for women that are trying to raise their children. And I remember that they were actually prophesied in a talk I heard many years ago by Belle Smith, back when it was, not Belle Spafford, Barbara Smith. There was Belle Spafford and Barbara Smith, she of the great hair. She said that, and the internet was just barely crawling into being, and she said, "You'll see a day when people will work from their homes and have little cottage industries on the internet." And she was exactly right. Well, this has become extremely popular with young moms, especially. And my daughter, who is a young mom herself, teaches a branding workshop. And people come. 50 people came and paid quite a lot of money on Friday to watch her from 10 in the morning till 7 at night, teach them how to take their little cottage industry, whatever it was, and brand it so that people could identify it. And I went partly because I'm her mom and I wanted to see her do it, and also because I write these books and every one of them looks different, and once I've written them, I'm not interested in them anymore. I want to write the next one. And so I thought, well, I wonder if there's a painless way to just sort of make them do something so that I didn't have to do it. And it turns out that there's a lot of interesting things to know about yourself. Every one of you has a persona, and it manifests itself to other people in a certain way, to your children, to your grandchildren, to the people you know. At my father's funeral, we had a little section, my dad's name is Lumen, and we had a little section, one of the kids talked about Luminisms. You know, there were things that my dad said that nobody else said, you know. "Shoot, Luke, the air is full of birds." That meant something. I don't know what it meant, but we all knew that it meant something, you know. And he had a million things like that he would say. You know, he never asked his wife to get him some mustard or some mayonnaise or whatever. He'd hold up his sandwich and say, "Doctor me, Jeannie." And so that has remained, you know. Craig will say, "Doctor me, Jeannie," and I'll know that he thinks I'm going to go get him some mustard. Anyway, these little things that made him lovable and also identified him uniquely. One of the things that Allison taught us on Friday was to identify and to narrow down to one word what we felt our message was, that our life was exemplifying. What is it that we're passionate about? And it was a very difficult exercise She started with the 6 basic human needs, and down it went, and down it went, and down it went, and down it went, and we broke up into these groups, and we had to think about what, for example, why do I write these books? What is it I want to do with them, and what word would describe what it is I'm trying to do with my life and my energy? Another thing that Allison taught us that was very interesting was that we tend to use certain words over and over. And so this is her speaking to one of the groups that she had asked her to come and speak. And she said, as she was talking about branding, she said, "If you put the word freaking in a sentence, it sounds like I said it." And so there, see, she said, if you feel called to do it, freaking do it. And that's Allison. She's a little off the wall, sometimes extremely off the wall, sometimes not even anywhere near a wall. And but people kind of love that about her. I do too. And she has identified over the years what it is about her that helps other people find their confidence and courage. And so she encouraged us to do the same. I had all of this in my mind as I went to the study of Mark. I know I said we were going to start with Matthew, but I lied. When I went home and started studying the lesson, I thought we have to start with the oldest gospel. We have to start with the earliest one, even though it doesn't come first in the collection. And it's because Matthew and Luke used Mark for 90% of their material. And so we got to start with Mark. And so, but I want to start here with, what is your message? What would you say, and I'm not going to ask you to raise your hand and tell me, but I'd like you to be thinking about, what's your message in life? What message are you communicating, and how do you communicate it? How do you get your message across to your children, to your grandchildren? What is it that you would like to say, that people would say about you when you died? Tara Campbell was just talking to me about her aunt, and she said up until the day she died, she was giving, right up and almost till the minute she died. She was serving others. And there may be something that you would like to feel that your life is communicating. And how does that get communicated? We also had time to spend with our grandchildren up there. Our oldest grandchild, Ginger, holds a particular place in all of our hearts because Allison, our middle child, and Eric were the first to marry in our family, and they gave us our first grandchild, Ginger. And Eric is also the first to marry in his family of his 4 brothers. And so Allison and Eric's daughter, Ginger, is the oldest grandchild for the Robertson family as well. They have 9 grandchildren, and we have 9 grandchildren. And so Ginger reigns supreme over these 18 grandchildren and loves, loves, loves every one of them. She's a very, very special little girl. And she had a remarkable experience in those couple of weeks before I came, and I particularly wanted to spend some time with Ginger and talk about this life-changing experience that she had. Along that line, I'd like to bear a personal testimony as we begin, that what we talked about last week about angels and miracles and getting help with the things that we need. I received emails from several of you sharing your testimonies about ways that angels have helped you in your lives, miracles that have happened to you. I'm so thankful that that touched you the way it touched me. And I hope that you are writing these things down in your notebook so that your children and your grandchildren can share them. I want to bear a little testimony about something that happened to me in regard to this little book came out this week, my book, The User-Friendly Old Testament. This was a book that I didn't think would happen because Craig was so ill and I couldn't think, I just couldn't think. I was able to do our lesson every week. That seemed like it was almost a link to sanity for me during what were really the first 6 months of 2017 were by far the worst 6 months I've ever lived through. And I couldn't think at all how anything could get written. I'd written about 100 pages of the book before Craig was diagnosed with cancer, and then after that, I just couldn't think. One night I was lying in bed. I hadn't realized exactly what the program was, but around March, the publisher wrote me and said, "Do you have a table of contents?" And I thought, sure. So I made a table of contents, but there were no contents. I just made the table of contents and sent it to them, and I thought, that'll keep them off my back for a while, and maybe pretty soon I'll be able to think. And then along about May, they sent me this cover design and said, "Do you like the cover design?" And I really liked it, because like the Old Testament tablets are iPhones, you know, so I kind of thought, now they're getting there. They're kind of getting the idea that this is a modern approach, and so I like that, so I said, sure, I like that. And then in June, they wrote me a thing and said, you have to have the thing written by July 14th because you had a table of contents and a cover. It's in the catalogs and stores are buying it. And so I thought, oh my gosh. I mean, really? You're kidding me. Who's going to write that? And so I was a little, that was right after Craig had gone into the hospital for his stem cell transplant. We were into June, and I was lying in bed one night, and I thought, you know, it's been a lifelong goal of mine. I would like to write some books about the scriptures that were a little more friendly, that were a little less intimidating. And I just thought it was sad because I knew that if I didn't complete this book, they wouldn't want me to write the next one, and the next one, I wouldn't be able to continue the series. And I went to sleep thinking about that, and I woke up at 5 in the morning thinking a thought that I hadn't had. These lectures are all filmed originally so that my mother could watch them. And so that all of the information that I gather each week for these lessons is on there, but if you'll notice, I don't take very many notes. I just sort of stoke it all up and do the slides, and then by about Friday, I've forgotten it all. And so I thought, oh, I couldn't think how I could just listen to the lesson and then think how to write a chapter from it. And then the thought occurred to me, I know that this is probably obvious to many of you, but I'd never thought of it. I thought, I wonder if it's possible to get a transcript of a video. I didn't even know how you'd do that. So at 5 in the morning, I took my computer and I Googled, can you get a transcript of a video? And immediately up came a little company called Rev.com, and it said, within 12 hours, we will send you a word-for-word transcript of any YouTube video that you want. Just send us the URL. So I typed in 4 of the lessons, and within 4 hours, I had the first one, word for word, written down. By the end of the day, I had ordered 12, and that gave me the basis for 12 chapters. It so happened that Craig kind of made an amazing recovery at about that point, and I asked him, could you just take care of me for about 10 days instead of me take care of you? And he said, sure, I feel pretty good. What do you want me to do? And so we just switched roles, and he took care of me, and I sat about 8 to 10 hours every day and wrote as fast as I could write. And the book got done. The thing that was really a testimony to me was about a week after I had received one of those transcripts, I received an email from somebody who lives in Florida, whose name was Darren. And he had fallen on a ladder and had to have a surgery. And it caused his family to have a lot of extra medical expenses. And so he found a job transcribing YouTube videos at night, along with his normal job. He'd been so discouraged about this fall, he wrote me, and how he had a wife and a little daughter, and how hard life was for him. And just how it seemed like everything had gone wrong, he said, I felt I'd lost my faith in God. And then I was sent this transcript about the 10 Commandments. And he said, and all the time that I typed, I felt God's love. And he said, I'm not supposed to write the person whose lesson I transcribed, but I want to thank you for testifying to me of God's love. And he said, and would you please tell Ross, who played the guitar that day, remember, and sang Teach Your Children? He said, would you please tell Ross how much his music touched my heart? And I wrote him back, and he wrote me back, and I sent him a Book of Mormon, and there's a lot of things in there for me. I often wonder why I go to the trouble to write a book. There's so many books. But I'm personally absolutely convinced I went to Japan and learned the whole language just to meet one person. And so, you know, maybe all this was just for Darren. But if any of you would like one, there's a box of them out there, and all the money goes to the CRC. So it's a testimony to me that each of us has a message, whatever that message is, and however we choose to convey it. Now that we've talked all about that, we're going to talk about how you can convey your message more cleverly by watching what Mark does. In the Gospel of Mark, if you'll open to that, Mark does this amazing thing that nobody had ever done before, well as he does it. And it's called a Markan sandwich in his honor. He makes little sandwiches of his topics, and we'll see how he does it. And then we'll take a little look at what Mark might want us to do. But first of all, let's talk about who Mark was. He was not one of the apostles, was he? We go Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John when we say the Gospels, but he was not one of the apostles. He never personally met Jesus. He was converted with his mother. He and his mother Mary, everybody's mother seems to be Mary, lived in Jerusalem and met Peter and Paul And he may also have been Barnabas's cousin. There appears to be a close relationship between him and Barnabas. He is mentioned first in the book of Acts, verse 12, where he is mentioned as being one of the disciples of Jesus. But this is after the death of Jesus. He also did not speak Greek or Hebrew as his first language. Aramaic was the colloquial language. That was the language that Jesus spoke. That was also the language that he spoke. And so he wrote his gospel in Greek, but it wasn't his first language. His Greek is, the scholars tell us, a very conversational Greek, and it's very active. Mark is by far the shortest gospel, about 11,000 words. All of the others have about 18 or 19 or 20,000 words. And so it's only about 2/3 as long as the other gospels. And he goes quickly through things. We'll notice it. Another thing that Mark is doing is he's writing from a very strong oral history. Have you ever noticed when you go back in your journals or you go back in your letters and you refer to things that you thought you would always remember and you can't remember what you were referring to or where you were when you wrote the letter? And in my case, many times when I'm looking at the pictures, I can't tell which baby it is. You know, it's embarrassing. I should have always written on the back of things, but we think I'll always remember this. Well, the oral tradition was extremely strong, and Mark knew this great oral tradition. He spent a lot of time with Peter. It's obvious that he spent a lot of time with Peter, and we know from the scriptures and also from the writings of a couple of people who wrote about 100 years after Jesus died, one of whom was Eusebius, who wrote an ecclesiastical history about 100 AD. And he said this, Mark, Peter's former interpreter. So Peter probably did not speak Greek and used Mark as an interpreter when he was preaching. Wrote down carefully, but not always in order, all that he heard Peter teach of the Lord's teachings and actions. Mark's purpose was to leave nothing out that he heard. And so we may call the Gospel of Mark the memoirs of Peter. And I had never really known this before, but then when I went through and listened to the Gospel of Mark, and I listened to it all in 2 batches, you can listen to the entire thing in 2 hours. It's about like listening to Dickens' Christmas Carol. You can listen to the whole thing at a sitting. You will notice that there is a lot of information, personal information about Peter in Mark's gospel. We notice in Luke, right, that he's interviewed the women. That's the thing we know, because Mary's innermost feelings are there. There's a lot of, it's obvious that Luke has had interaction with the important women in Jesus' life. The thing I didn't realize is that Peter is the person who comes through in Mark's gospel. And once I got that, it was very exciting to go back and read it again. And one of the things that Peter seems to be very adamant that we know is the entire story of how he denied the Savior. In fact, scholars, one of the things they look for when they're trying to decide, is this authentic or did somebody put this in 500 years later? One of the things they look for is when the person looks bad, because you wouldn't put that in if you were trying later to make a certain point. In other words, people who thought Peter was the head of the church and the first pope, and you have these monks that are translating and redoing the scriptures, they're not going to put that in about Peter. People who loved him wouldn't put that in there. The only person that would put that in there is humble Peter himself, who wanted you to know the condescension of God, how far God had come to forgive him. And Peter made sure that that was in there. So Mark's gospel is what they call an ancient biography. And an ancient biography is a biography unlike our biographies in that it doesn't start the day you're born and it doesn't end the Let's do an example that's really a beautiful one from chapter 5. Let's just read Mark 5 closely together. I'm going to read this time from the Jewish translation. And we'll see where the sandwich begins. The chapter begins with a man who is possessed by a devil. And he comes and he speaks to Jesus, and he recognizes Jesus for who he is. This is sort of like the hors d'oeuvre of this chapter. He recognizes Jesus for who he is, and Jesus speaks to the evil spirits within the man and says, "What is your name?" A thing that you might notice in Mark a lot are names. Verse 21 of Mark 5, when Jesus had crossed over again in the boat to the other side, a great crowd gathered around him, and he was by the sea. And then one of the leaders of the synagogue, so what kind of man would this be? Jewish. And he's one of the leaders of the synagogue, came to him, and his name was Jairus. That's how you say it. Jairus came. And when he saw him, he fell at his feet. So this is something to see, right? One of the leaders of the synagogue falling at the feet of Jesus, and begged him repeatedly, "My little daughter is at the point of death. Come and lay your hands on her so that she may be made well and live." And so he went with him. There's the first piece of bread in the Markan sandwich. The story is introduced to us. If we were telling the story, we would just go on and tell the rest of the story. But Mark, in a very artistic and also meaningful way, puts us on hold. And a large crowd followed him and pressed in on him. Are you all with me? We're in Mark 5:25. Now there was a woman who had been suffering from hemorrhages for 12 years. She had endured much under many physicians. That's a line that means a lot to all of us, doesn't it? To have endured much under many physicians. Can you think of all the things doctors have done to you that they either didn't need to do or that they hadn't thought very much about or that really hurt? And these are doctors in our modern age. Imagine the kinds of things they came up with to heal someone who probably had a need for a hysterectomy. She had spent all that she had, and she was no better, but rather grew worse. She had heard about Jesus and came up behind him in the crowd and touched his cloak, for she said, "If I but touch his clothes, I will be made well." Immediately her hemorrhage stopped, and she felt in her body that she was healed of her disease. I'm in verse 30. Immediately aware that power had gone forth from him, Jesus turned about in the crowd and said, "Who touched my clothes?" And his disciples said to him, "You see the crowd pressing in on you. How can you say, 'Who touched me?'" He looked all around to see who had done it. But the woman, knowing what had happened to her, came in fear and trembling and fell down before him and told him the whole truth. He said to her, "Daughter, your faith has made you well. Go in peace and be healed of your disease." That's the middle of the sandwich. Here comes the other piece of bread in verse 35. While he was still speaking, some people came from the leader's house to say, "Your daughter is dead. Why trouble the teacher anymore?" But overhearing what they said, Jesus said to the leader of the synagogue, "Do not fear, only believe." He allowed no one to follow him except Peter, James, and John. This is another way that we know that Mark talked to Peter, because no one followed Jesus into that room except these three men. When they came to the house of the leader of the synagogue, he saw a commotion, people weeping and wailing loudly, as was the common custom in that day. You even paid people to come and wail. When he had entered, he said to them, "Why do you make a commotion and weep? This child is not dead, but sleeping." And they laughed at him. Then he put them all outside and took the child's father and mother and those who were with him and went in where the child was. He took her by the hand and said to her, "Talitha kum," which means, "Little girl, get up." Mark's first language was Aramaic, and my mission president was a wonderful Hawaiian Japanese. His first language was English, but he learned Japanese in his home. And your first language is the language to you in which you say the things that mean the most. All of you who speak a second language know how difficult it is to say in a second language what seems to come naturally to you in your first language. It used to be the cutest thing when he would go around and speak at conferences, because he would be speaking in Japanese, but when he would get to the word that really meant the most to him, he would say it in English, because he just couldn't believe the Japanese would say it. And so the people would be going like this, and they'd think, "What did he just say?" You need to have a they couldn't get the word because he would say it in English. But he just couldn't bring himself to say it in that second language. I feel Mark here saying, I wish you could hear what Jesus said. He said it in his own language. It's like when he says, Abba, Father. That's Aramaic. It means daddy. It doesn't mean father. Talitha kum, little girl, get up. There's something tender about it that we're not getting. And Mark wants us to get that. He wants us to get the tenderness in Jesus' language. And immediately the girl got up and began to walk about. She was 12 years of age. At this they were overcome with amazement. He strictly ordered them that no one should know this. And he told them to give her something to eat. Always concerned about people and their needs. That's a Markan sandwich. It happens 12 times at least in the book of Mark. In 12 different chapters. The story is begun, something's in the middle, and the same story is ended at the end. And this way of teaching is extremely effective. And I would just like to submit to you that as a teacher or a speaker, you ought to learn how to make a Markan sandwich. You ought to learn how to do this. It's very easy. Next time you give a lesson or a talk, think about starting a story, leaving it hanging, and then coming back to it at the end. It's just something that Jesus, through Mark, teaches us. Here's 3 great moments in Mark that all appear in Markan sandwiches. This first one that we just did, Jesus having power over death. The second one that I just wanted to bring up to you, that I think is a beautiful one, and that Mark wants to make sure that we take notice of, is given in the chapter where Jesus cleanses the temple. Let's see what happens on either side of him cleansing the temple in Mark 11. This is an interesting sandwich. It's a kind of a vegetarian sandwich. When they were approaching Jerusalem in chapter 11 at Bethphage and Bethany near the Mount of Olives, he sent 2 of his disciples and said to them, go into the village ahead of you and you'll find a colt and you'll do the thing. So it opens. Once again, there's usually an opening scene. In the opening scene of the last one, there was a man who had multiple devils that Jesus healed. And then he went into this life and death thing with a little girl and a woman and a little girl. And he healed these gentle creatures, these gentle women of death and of a lifelong illness. In this case, he comes into Jerusalem, and this is the sign of the Messiah. He comes in on the donkey, and people lay down the palm fronds and say, Hosanna, blessed is he who comes in the name of the Lord. And so we're coming along on this very triumphant moment, and then the sandwich begins on verse 11. He entered Jerusalem and went into the temple, and when he'd looked around at everything, as it was already late, he went out to Bethany with the 12. So he just kind of went in and looked around at the temple. What do you think he saw when he went in at night? Everything was closed down, but he went in and looked around at the temple. What's going to happen in this chapter? Do you know? We have a picture of it. He's going to, the next day, he's going to braid a cord and drive all the people out. So what was probably there? Tables, cash registers, the stuff that they were selling. He went in and just looked around. And I never noticed this before until I read this chapter carefully. He looked around the night before, and he saw, and he started fuming about it, I think. On the following day, when they came from Bethany, and Bethany, as you know, is where Lazarus and Martha and Mary live, and it's about 4 miles from Jerusalem. So it's a little walk out and a little walk back. He was hungry after that walk. Seeing in the distance, in verse 13, a fig tree in leaf, he went to see whether perhaps he would find anything on it. When he came to it, he found nothing but leaves, for it was not the season for figs. He said to it, "May no one ever eat fruit from you again." And the disciples heard it. That's the piece of bread right there. And then they came to Jerusalem in verse 15, and he entered the temple and began to drive out those who were selling and those who were buying in the temple, and he overturned the tables of the money changers and the seats of those who sold doves. And he would not allow anyone to carry anything through the temple. He was teaching and saying, "It is written that my house shall be called a house of prayer for all the nations, but you have made it a den of robbers." And when the chief priests and scribes heard it, they kept looking for a way to kill him, for they were afraid of him, because the whole crowd was spellbound by his teaching. And when the evening came, Jesus and his disciples went back out of the city. There's the middle of the sandwich. Here's the other piece of bread. In the morning, as they passed by, they saw the fig tree withered away to its roots. Then Peter Once again, Mark's heard Peter tell this story. Then Peter remembered and said to him, Rabbi, look, the fig tree that you cursed has withered. Jesus answered them, have faith in God. Truly, I tell you, if you say to this mountain, be taken up and thrown into the sea, and if you do not doubt in your heart, but believe that what you say will come to pass, it will be done for you. So I tell you, whatever you ask for in prayer, believe that you've received it and it will be yours. So there's the sandwich. Why do we put that stuff in the middle of those? Why is cleansing the temple in the middle of the fig story? Let's just, once again, we're just going to brainstorm about it. Why did we put these two things together?
Is it because it shows his frustration in both scenarios? I mean, obviously one is a little bit more of a physical way.
I like that. It shows Jesus, it shows a side of Jesus, a frustrated side. And even an angry side, righteous anger. I was thinking last week when I told that story about the guy who pulled up to the homeless man and thought, I'm not going to give him a $100 bill, and something in his mind said, yeah, like you'd miss it. I thought, isn't it fun if guardian angels can be sarcastic? I mean, it's like they're not necessarily scripted, right? I hadn't thought about that. But I'm sure if I got a guardian angel, it would be sarcastic. And if I became one, I would say, yeah, like you'd miss it, Personalities exist, and Jesus had a personality. He wasn't just a combination of righteousness. He was righteousness with a personality, and you see his personality. What else binds these stories together? Cindy?
Well, I see the difference between the spiritual and the temporal. So the sandwich to me is, on the bookends, he's talking about faith and whatever, but in the temple, what should have been the most spiritual place has become this temporal, not spiritual at all.
That's wonderful. So what Cindy just said is the temporal and the spiritual are combined here. You have a fig tree with fruit, that should be fairly straightforward. The temple should be a very spiritual place, and it isn't. It's a place where buying and selling is taking forth and where God's Spirit really isn't. And he's teaching a lesson about faith on either end with the fig tree. Anything else about that? Yes, Susan.
When I think about the fig tree story, I think about people who act like they're righteous. People who put on the air of righteousness, but really there's no proof there.
So it's like the whited sepulchres that he would talk about, where you look like a beautiful monument, but there's dead men's bones inside. You're a big leafy tree. You might all be dressed in your Pharisaical robes and have your prayer shawl on and look like you're really righteous, but there's nothing inside. You're not giving any fruit. You have nothing. You're not nourishing the people. So Susan sees hypocrisy there in both places. I think that's a marvelous interpretation, where it looks like it should have fruit, and it doesn't. And that's just what the temple is right now. It looks like it should be bearing fruit, but it isn't. Yes?
I don't think it is as far as purpose goes, but we all, the purpose of the fig tree was to bear fruit, and yet there was no fruit.
Mm-hmm.
The purpose of the temple also is not being
It's not being fulfilled. Yeah.
fulfilled. And so you have the purpose. So we can kind of liken that to ourselves. Are we living in our purpose?
That's marvelous. The purpose, if you use the word purpose in this chapter, this is a purpose sandwich, kind of, where the fig tree, the purpose of the fig tree, what is the purpose? What's the message? What's the brand? The fig tree says, when you look at it, I'm a fig tree. I will give you figs. And it doesn't. The temple says, I am God's house. You'll feel my spirit here. And you don't. So the purpose of the thing itself is not being fulfilled. It's false advertising. It's false branding. Its message is not what it is. And that kind of thing really bothered him. That was one of the things that he really did not like. Is he always said, a harlot who just is what she is. She looks like what she is. Her branding is all consistent. She looks like what she is. She's going to heaven before the guy who looks righteous and in his heart is evil. That to him was a greater sin and maybe a greater problem, because it has to do with being a stranger to yourself, doesn't it? It has to do with not being true to who you are. Now, what is Mark's message? What does he want to tell us? We have to do this. The other great moment in Mark I just thought we had to talk about is how Jesus knows our weakness. Let's just go to chapter 14. I can hardly read this chapter because when we have the before and after picture of Peter, I can relate to the before frightened one. Beautiful. I want you, when you have moments, read all of the introduction that leads up to the denial of Peter. He goes to Gethsemane. He asks them to wait for him and watch. He is arrested. He goes to the high priest. All of this thing is happening in this 14th chapter. It's very, very dramatic. And then in verse 66, we're almost to the end of Mark 14. While Peter was below in the courtyard, one of the servant girls of the high priest came by. And this is going to be 3 times. When she saw Peter warming himself, she stared at him and said, "You also were with Jesus, the man from Nazareth." But he denied it, saying, "I do not know or understand what you are talking about." So he tries to, first of all, just cloak it by saying he doesn't know what she's talking about. Then the cock crowed. Oops, the cock didn't crow then. I do not know what, yes. And he went out into the forecourt, and then the cock crowed. So that crowed once. And then the servant girl, on seeing him, began again to say to the bystanders, "This man is one of them." But again he denied it, 2nd time. And then after a little while, the bystanders again said to Peter, because they could tell by his speech, "Certainly you are one of them, for you are a Galilean." But he began to curse and swore an oath, "I do not know this man you are talking about." So he went from just trying to act like he didn't know what was going on to out and out lying and swearing with an oath that he didn't know Jesus. No question that that is the lowest moment of his life. At that moment, as Jesus had said to him, "Before the cock crows twice, you will deny me thrice." At that moment, the cock crowed for the 2nd time. And Peter remembered that Jesus had said to him, "Before the cock crows twice, you will deny me 3 times. And he broke down and wept. My heart goes out to him. And he made sure that this is here, so that every time, every one of us have a moment that we can look back on and say, "I can't believe I was that weak. I can't believe I was that stupid. I can't believe I said that or didn't say that or didn't witness that or do what I should." And this is here for us because we watch where Peter went from there. He spent the rest of his life making up for that moment and being the great, courageous leader that he was. So Jesus wants us to know that he knows our weaknesses. He wants us to know that he has power over death. Mark wants us to know these things about him. And because he spends 1/5 of his gospel talking about the atonement, we know that Mark wants us to tarry there as well. When Jesus said to his disciples, "Tarry here and watch," that's what he wants us to do. As a young missionary, I'm going to read you this little story. Elder Orson F. Whitney, who later served in the Quorum of the Apostles, had a dream that changed his life forever, and he wrote this. "One night I dreamed that I was in the Garden of Gethsemane, a witness of the Savior's agony. I stood behind a tree in the foreground. Jesus, with Peter, James, and John, came through a little wicket gate at my right. Leaving the 3 apostles there after telling them to kneel and pray, he passed over to the other side where he also knelt and prayed. 'Oh, my Father, if it will be possible, let this cup pass from me. Nevertheless, not as I will, but as thou wilt.' As he prayed, the tears streamed down his face, which was turned toward me. I was so moved at the sight that I wept also, out of pure sympathy for his great sorrow. My whole heart went out to him. I loved him with all my soul. I longed to be with him as I had longed for nothing else. Presently Jesus arose and walked to where the apostles were kneeling fast asleep. He shook them gently, awoke them in a tone of tender reproach, untinctured by the least show of anger or scolding. He asked them if they could not watch with him 1 hour. Returning to his place, he prayed again and then went back and found them again sleeping. And again he woke them, admonished them, and returned and prayed as before. 3 times this happened until I was perfectly familiar with his appearance, face, form, and movements. He was of noble stature and majestic mien, the very God that he was and is, and yet as meek and lowly as a little child. All at once the circumstance seemed to change. Instead of before, it was now after the crucifixion, and the Savior, with those 3 apostles, now stood together in a group at my left. They were about to depart and ascend into heaven. I could endure it no longer. I ran from behind the tree. I fell at his feet. I clasped him around the knees, and I begged him to take me with him. I shall never forget the kind and gentle manner in which Jesus stooped and raised me up and embraced me. It was so vivid, so real, that I felt the very warmth of his bosom against which I rested. And then he said, "No, my son, these have finished their work. But you have not finished yours. They may go with me, but you must stay and finish yours." Still I clung to him, gazing up into his face, for he was taller than I. I besought him most earnestly, "Well, promise me that I will come to you at the last." He smiled sweetly and tenderly and replied, "That will depend entirely upon yourself." I awoke with a sob in my throat, and it was morning. Whatever is the message of our life, I think Mark wants us to know that the most important thing that we can do is be a witness of Christ. The Gospel of Mark ends with Jesus saying, "Go you into all the world and bear testimony of me." And we may say, okay, well, that means the missionary program, or that means this or that. My daughter, who is an expert on branding and can speak in public like almost nobody I've seen, gave the most important message of her life in a whispered ear 2 weeks ago. No one heard this message. Someone snapped a picture of it, of the darling little 18 grandchildren that the Robertsons share with us. Little Gavin is the youngest. He's 3 months old. And the thing that most people don't know about Allison, that I didn't even know until recently, is that she goes to the temple every week. Sometime during the week, she will take some time and she makes sure that she is in the temple once a week. She was in the temple with her husband doing sealings, and she began to think about the name Gavin. And they have a friend who had had a little child named Gavin who had died. And so she thought, I need to go home and write a note to them and let them know that I was thinking about Gavin. But when they came out to their car and they turned on their phones, the message came from the Robertson family. The little 3-month-old Gavin, that was their own grandchild and their own niece and nephew, had died in his sleep while they were putting the other children to bed. And that family was plunged into the kind of despair that all of us dread. But Allison knew that God had Gavin in his hands, for she had had that message come into her heart. This is a picture of Allison at the graveside with our darling Ginger. And I don't need to be there to know what she is saying in Ginger's ear. She's witnessing of Jesus, as my mother did to me, as her mother did to her, as her mother did to her. We know where we came from. We know where we're going. We know that Jesus has power over death. And if we keep our covenants, if we go to the temple, if we do the things that we need to do to have the Spirit of the Lord with us, when the moment comes that that witness needs to be born, we will know how to bear it. You don't have to be a great public speaker. You don't have to be particularly talented. You don't have to write a book. All you have to have is the testimony of Jesus. And he will help you share that testimony in a way that will bring comfort at a moment when there is no other comfort. I know that this comfort is real. I know that Jesus is our Savior. I could not be more grateful than to know that I was not called to raise children alone in this scary world. But when moments like this come, they know to whom they should turn. And that comfort will be there, even if I'm not, because that comfort is the most real in the world. And of this I bear testimony in the name of Jesus Christ. Amen.